Hello, my name is Chani Esther and Dictor Portner, and you are listening to Passing the Paintbrush, a queer Jewish podcast and workshop series focusing on queer Jewish artists who worked, lived, and loved in Berlin Mitte. In this episode, we will take some time to learn about Lotte Laserstein, the Jewish-German-Swedish oil painter who made works such as Abend über Potsdam and Am Motorrad. She created over 10,000 works in mostly oil on canvas and paper, but her travel watercolor sketches are also wonderful, and she did printmaking such as etchings and designed ex librisses, and illustrated an anatomy text. Her portraits showed not only the world around her, but her inner emotional landscapes through her use of rich colors and textures. On this journey, I visited many locations in Berlin where Laserstein had significant roots and connections. I walked around the neighborhood where she first lived in Friedenau. I paid my respects to her memorial plaque in Schöneberg and her mom's house in Stieglitz. I went hiking in Grunewald. I made an appointment to view some of her estate documents and art at the Berlinische Gallerie, searched through documents at the Akademie der Kunst, and I interviewed the many guests you will hear in this piece. I did not make it to Sweden, but Laserstein traveled to San Francisco and Los Angeles, which is where I spent many moments of my childhood and adolescence. I read many articles and traveled to the Jewish Museum to sit in their well-air-conditioned library during one of the hottest days of the year to read about Laserstein and look at the books and materials available. I did my best to listen with my whole self and bring you with me as I discovered and learned more about who Lotte Laserstein was and what she means to us today. A content note. In this episode, listeners should be aware that the following topics will be talked about that may be triggering or difficult to listen to. In this episode, we will discuss the Shoah, anti-Semitism, misogyny, queer erasure, homophobia, exile, police violence, and there is mention of macabre anatomy learning methods and drugging an animal for art. We will be talking about illness, death, murder, eugenics, starvation, unhealthy relationships, suicide, exile, and naming specific concentration camps and the fates of those who did not survive. Please take care while listening.
Love me or hate me, I don't care. Been called these names before, go ahead and stare. Won't be shamed for who I am, 'cause I know just where I stand. Millennia of survival runs in my blood. I'm an Eshet Chayil, and I don't give up. Go on, do your worst, try and push me around. Nothing you do's gonna keep me down. Shame me, chain me, you'll never win. Every time I fall, I rise up again.
Laserstein has been gaining fame in Germany and the world in the last 25 years and is now being understood by and analyzed by some people through the lens of queer theory. In the first workshop at Spinnboden on Laserstein in May for Queer History Month, Clara Julia Escalera was the guest history expert.
I'm Clara Julia Escalera. My pronouns are she, her, and I have a master in intercultural communication. I am a freelancing artist, and I'm writing my PhD about Lotte Laserstein, or about the queer discourses on Lotte Laserstein.
I asked Clara how she found out about Laserstein and became interested in researching her.
I went to the exposition in the Berlinische Gallerie on Lotte Laserstein, and I saw like her sensual paintings, and I was quite impressed on her, and I had the feeling something was maybe missing out in the descriptions and the text next to the paintings, and I was wondering why, and I started the research on lesbian visibility in art, because that happened as well to other artists I saw, where I would say there could be another interpretation than what is written in the gallery, and I wanted to know why there's nothing written about, because I went in there and I saw, why isn't said anything about this intimate, very, very intimate relationship? Because they look, for me, I thought, okay, there must have been something between them more than a friendship. And then the idea came up to do research on lesbian visibility, and after a couple of years I decided to concentrate on just one person, and I concentrated on Lotte Laserstein because I really like her paintings. I like the way she's painting. I like this fine stroke brush and the quality, the colors, and the feelings that she is transporting through her paintings, and the content, like how she is painting women was particular and was special. And so I brought my idea on lesbian visibility together with her. I would say to make it more visible, it opens a new perspective on the art of Lotte Laserstein. It doesn't change the opinion, or it doesn't explain much about her or how her life actually was, but it tells a different thing about the paintings when you say that it might be lesbian without saying that she was. Right. So it would be a quite easy way, I would say, how to deal with that. Yeah. And I would say in general visibility is important for, let's say, in identification. Like if you never see yourself represented in space, like also museums, it does something, and it sets a norm, and it always gives you the feeling that you're not part of the group who is represented, and you're outside of the norm. And it's also it's a general thing about representation. It's not only sexuality. It's also about color of the skin, and it's about religion. It's about class. It's about disability, and it's none of it is really very good included. So that's it's a chance. It's a chance to do it differently, and it's only the question how you can do it, because there's always the risk of having a representation and then repeating the discrimination. Because in the moment that you show when you talk about a person being lesbian, then you're repeating the norm that this is different than the others, and so it's not an easy task, and it's also not easy in the way of in the case of sexuality, and especially in the for Lotte Laserstein, when there is no evidence. So and if you can't say she's a lesbian because there are no hints, nobody talked about it, there's nothing written about, then you can only work with the gaze, where we come to a little bit later, and this is more difficult.
And before we get to the exciting topic that is gaze analysis, let's learn about Laserstein's early life and how she became someone we are exploring today.
Eshet Chayil, woman of valor. Eshet Chayil, woman of valor.
On November 28, 1898, in Königsberg, now Kaliningrad, Lotte Mette Ida Laserstein was born to Mette Birnbaum Laserstein and pharmacist Hugo Laserstein. When she was only a toddler in 1902, her father died, and the family of Mette, Lotte, and younger sister Käthe Laserstein went to live with Mette's family, sister Elsa or Elizabeth, who had a painting school, and her grandmother, Ida Birnbaum, in Gdansk or Danzig, the Baltic seaport in Poland, with a very interesting Jewish history. Mette Laserstein played and taught piano lessons and painted porcelain. There are really sweet photos of Lotte Laserstein being taught how to paint by her Aunt Elsa when she was a child, with her aunt bending over her work, kindly gesturing to Laserstein about her art. Laserstein was sketching in her youth, and there are surviving sketches of a beautiful, colorful meadow, an extremely vibrant and realistic-looking country house, and her family sitting together around the table from 1910. She was using charcoal, graphite, watercolors, and gouache to create her works, and at this young age, she decided she did not want to marry and instead become an artist. In 1912, Ida Birnbaum, Mette, Kata, and Lotte Laserstein all moved to Berlin. The sisters went to Chamizo-Schule, an all-girls school in Schöneberg, where they could study for their university entrance exams. Lotte Laserstein visited museums and deepened her artistic education. She lived with her family until she was in her late 20s at Steyerstrasse 19, where there's now a church. In 1918, Laserstein became a student at the Friedrich Wilhelm University to study art and philosophy. In 1919, the Akademie der Kunst opened its proverbial doors to women. During this time, she took courses in commercial graphic art training with Adolf Prof, making beautiful, brightly colored, and bold designs. He did not believe she could succeed being accepted at the Academy, but Laserstein would prove him wrong. From 1920 to 1921, she studied privately with Leo von Koenig and painted a portrait of her grandmother doing her handiwork with white hair and glasses. Another painting from 1921 shows her mother, Mette, staring off into the distance, and to the left in the background there are housing blocks in a rusty brown, red, and purple-gray blue. Her mom has a blank expression on her face and almost blurry features. You can see the start of elements of works to come in her nose and cheeks and lips. What stands out to me is Mette's beautiful blue eyes, yellow hair and eyebrows, and black turtleneck, and how she is rendered with a clear care and admiration, her arms crossed on her lap, with her delicate fingers holding her other hand tucked into her black cape. In 1921, Laserstein became one of the first women to be accepted to the Akademie der Kunst. She became a master's student of Jewish artist Erich Wolfsfeld. Even though she eventually graduated and gained many of her own students, her time at the Akademie was not so easy. To contribute to the family, Laserstein worked doing industrial design and illustrated a large anatomy textbook where she had to draw cadavers and did art for a carpet, ceramic, and toy manufacturer. In 1922, she wrote to the director of the Academy requesting her fees be waived due to family financial difficulties and her jobs in the decorative arts not being enough to pay for her education. In January of 1923, her request was accepted. She painted a very interesting self-portrait this year of her clothed with her hand on her breast, and Wolfsfeld drew a simple sketch of her nude in similar positions. Despite bullying and misogyny from her peers and teachers, in 1925, she received the Academy's Gold Medal. At the same time, she was taking courses at the Berlin University in art history and philosophy. I wanted to know more about etching since Wolfsfeld was a prolific etching printmaker, and this art process was taught in many studio classrooms in Berlin. In the archives of the Berlinische Gallerie, I also found and got to touch a beautiful etching plate Laserstein made of a young baby. I talked with Hadass Gilboa about this art style, process, and her experiences as a printmaker and etching teacher today, a century later in 2024.
So my name is Hadass Gilboa. My pronouns are she, her. And I'm an artist. Mostly I work in printmaking. My previous profession was an animator in film. That's what I actually studied. But obviously printmaking has become most of my life. Currently I run part of the workshops and the day-to-day business of the Litho Werkstatt in Berlin. The Litho Werkstatt is a small artist association that has been here for 38 years. Yes, and I specialize in etching. That's what I mostly do in printmaking. So etching is, I'd say, the metal-based part of printmaking. like anything in art, I guess, depending, of course, on the technique, there's lots of process into it. And it's very often a layered thing. So you need to go layer by layer. And sometimes you go backwards. And I love that. And sometimes I even love the process more than the actual plate or the print that I do.
It's all art.
Yeah, it's part of, I think it's just part of what I do today. So I don't always have an idea of what I'm doing. Sometimes I have just an idea, like, or just a little sketch, and then I work on the metal. And after printing, and very often that's when I discover what I'm working on and what's the story behind it. So those are my plates. They're all at the moment covered with a hard ground. So initially the idea of an etching is that you are preparing the plate. It's a metal plate. This is not a very good print. The last print is over there. You can kind of have a look at it. So you prepare the plate, whether it's copper or it's zinc.
Are these copper?
All these two are copper. This one is zinc. So you can see that it's like a silvery surface or a coppery surface. Yes, and they're covered in hard ground because what you do in etching is that you don't dry point you would be scraping a surface and creating the indentation where the ink would sit in. Etching is not like this. You are preparing the plate, covering with this kind of waxy material. You can touch it if you want.
Is that okay?
Yeah, absolutely. Nothing's going to happen to it. And then you can remove part of the hard ground to reveal the plate. And then the plate goes in the acid, and it's just being eaten up in the areas that are open, right? And so it's also very time-based. So if you want a very deep line, you need to leave it for a very long time in there. So this would be, in Italian, this technique is called acquaforte, eau forte in French, or just line etching. The next, or let's say you can also start from that, would be the aquatint. Aquatint is the surface. I like that the German make it very easy. So you have Hochdruck, which is high, so relief, which is wood, lino, etc. And then you have Tiefdruck, which is etching, dry point, gravure, so engraving, where you put the ink inside. And then you have Oberfläche, a surface print. To do the printing, once you have etched, we go into the printing process where we cover the whole plate with ink. Very often when the plate is hot, so that the ink is oil-based ink, it's better. I prefer working with oil-based ink. A lot of artists would also work with water-based. It's a question of preference, but you do need to heat a little bit the plate. The ink goes into your lines, and as I said, the whole surface is covered. And then then we need to go into the wiping process, where you actually remove the ink from all the areas that are white, and leave it in the lines or in the gradients here. So you can the gradients section, tiny dots.
Oh my goodness! Wow.
Where the ink is going to sit.
Yeah, they feel those small dots.
You can touch this as well. There's nothing. It's like the only thing that can happen to those plates is that they oxidate, and then you can just clean the oxidation out. It's not a problem.
Hadass worked the printing press so we could hear how it sounded to set it up and make a print.
So this, you have to tighten both spindle together.
Oh, interesting. Oh, it's pressing it down.
Yeah. I'm going to kind of do it a little bit, not too tight, so that I can show you how it rolls when it's holding both. One hand is a bit. I didn't tighten it too much, so this would be really, really gentle.
Oh, it's slow.
And if you have a paper, then that's how you get the indentation. Here you can barely see it here. Here maybe it's possible to see because your paper is wet. And that was the size of the plate, and so you have like something that goes in because the plate obviously has been pressed in. Yeah.
Wow! It's like a giant
steering wheel.
Yeah, exactly.
Or a ship.
Yeah.
Yes, definitely.
At the time that Laserstein was making art, she was already straddling labels and breaking out of boxes of what her art could be. Was it realism, new objectivity, her own thing? Her peers at the Akademie der Kunst were creating works that were breaking boundaries just like her, and also falling into the category of a unique Weimar style, new objectivity. I asked Eliza Coyle about her journey into studying this time period and art style. In conversation with Clara, we discussed how Laserstein often evades strict style categories and has been included in recent exhibitions about new objectivity.
But this way, they say, they widened the style of the new objectivity that she could fit in. So that's the art solution, I would say.
Right.
And in the end, that leads to a higher level of fame. So why not? Its intensity and its coldness. And often there's something that they describe, art historians or art scientists describe as a metallic smoothness in the paintings, or something like a glassy emptiness.
Ooh.
And this
glassy emptiness. Wow, wow.
Yeah, and you actually, if you see the paintings of nude objectivity, it's clear what they say. The skin is different, and the gaze that the people have, how they look, how their eyes look, that's different than in realistic paintings. For example, and in Lotte Laserstein, this biting criticism is missing. It's not in there, and also there's no metallic style how she's painting, and I would say it's a lot more subtle, and she doesn't show the criticism, but she shows, I would say, a really good alternative. So in her painting style, one would say it's more realistic. It's close to realism, and it's also a painting style that is close to the old masters, but it doesn't have the same content as the old masters, because it has modern content. It has the content that is sometimes similar to the content of the new objectivity.
Laserstein said this about her own art style.
What I do is not modern, but it is also not academic. It's just me.
During her studies, Laserstein met Gertrude Sussenbach, or Treptow Rose, born in 1903. She would become her favorite model, and Laserstein called her Hunchin, or Puppy. Treptow married Ernst Rose in 1933, and so she had the name Treptow Rose after. She was a really good model who could hold poses for a long time, and the homoerotic nature of these paintings radiates off the canvas. Clara tells us about her knowledge of their relationship and the stories she finds throughout the interpretation of their paintings.
What do we know about Laserstein and Treptow Rose? Well, we know that there is no evidence. You can't prove it. There are so many letters that they wrote. There are so many people that are talked to. Like Anna Carola Krause, who wrote the dissertation on Lotte Laserstein, did a really huge research, and she talked to quite a lot of people, and she couldn't find any proof. And so there are no comments at all. It can be totally understood like a really close friendship. If I remember right, it's like 3,000 pages of letters. They're really they were writing like people would write text messages on the phone, but they sent letters. So and there's nothing written in that where would really say, okay, you're my love, or like whatever. How you can for sure say, okay, this is more than a good friendship. But the story in the art is, from my point of view, is always a little bit of an interpretation. And I can say, yeah, maybe we don't know, and maybe I just don't want to interpret their their real relationship that they had, but I can more talk about the gaze and how I read the paintings.
The story of the painting.
This can be a different one, and how she meant it and how she wanted to look like. This is interpretation. Paintings of Treptow Rose that Lotte Laserstein painted. There are a lot of nude paintings, and there are single portraits, and there are double portraits, and there in some of them you can really see like a central erotic. This is also described in art science, and often bring that together. That there's something really erotic or maybe sexual, bring that together with the missing evidence, then the interpretation leads to an intimate friendship and to a really, really close, trusted relationship. But disconnecting that from the biographic evidences, then you can see another story, or you could see another story. You can see some of the images as a representation of queer or queer lesbian relationships or somehow connections. Maybe it's not always a relationship, but something else than heterosexual for sure. And in any case, this depiction differs from traditional ways of representation of women. Yeah, often like the female nude models were represented as they were painted as an object. Yeah, there were more objects than subjects. The subject was clearly the painter, and the nude model was an object who you could look at. So this is like the male gaze that you put on the paintings, and this you can't see in the paintings of Lotte Laserstein. Still, there's somehow a hierarchy between the closed painter and the nude model, but it's different. Laserstein shows her more eye to eye, and also like with her own history, and she's not only there for the viewer, for the beholder, and it's more that the model is more connected to the painter and not to the person who is looking at the painting. So the male gaze doesn't work here, and this is also why it's often said that she has something like a female gaze that is not so objectifying and not it's more based on equality and more sensual. Actually, I would call it it's a respectful gaze, because when you call it a female gaze, it's still, you make the difference between the male gaze that is always objectifying, but it's often like that, but it's actually not only, it's often connected to gender, but it doesn't have to. Yeah, about Lotte Laserstein and Traute Rose. For sure they were close, and this is not only what the paintings tell, it's also what people say, what the letters say. This is for sure. This is there you actually have an evidence on that, and that it's more than that you can only see in the paintings. If you are open to see it, then you can see it. Then you can leave it open as an option, and this, I would say, leaves it more open to. There's no wrong, right interpretation. It's more open. It's more perspectives, and it's even more story behind a painting. So it makes it even more interesting.
As there is no evidence or proof of a romantic relationship beyond what is depicted in the paintings themselves, the text of exhibitions and catalogues do not directly mention that the individuals portrayed were a couple. But when you describe the paintings with the presented intimacy, the intimacy between Rose and Laserstein, for example, one might think that at last there's a possibility that there has been a love relationship, and not only a friendship. It actually looks like. But well, nobody can prove that. The catalogues often acknowledge that while there's speculation about such relationships, there is no definite proof. But on the other hand, there is no comment that you can prove that she was not involved in a romantic relationship, because she herself was not asked. And if so, would she have answered freely about something so personal? Would she have been able to talk about that without any effect on her worth on the art market? The problem about art or science in general is that if there is no concrete evidence, one cannot make definite claims. And also, I think that's in some point important and okay, because this way you don't accidentally put people in a category where they don't want to be, where they don't want to belong. But just as there is no proof of a queer or lesbian relationship, there's also no evidence of Laserstein's heterosexuality. She was engaged at one point where one could talk about a proof, and she had close relationships with men, but those can't be proven as romantic relationships either. Nevertheless, the possibility of a romantic queer or lesbian relationship cannot be dismissed entirely. If this possibility is downplayed by emphasizing the lack of evidence, a problem comes up that is often referred to as heteronormativity. So, heterosexuality is the norm, the standard, and when someone is not proven to be queer, it is typically assumed that the person is heterosexual. The same logic applies when sexual orientation is not addressed at all. There is an overwhelming tendency to interpret the person as heterosexual. Thus, in the absence of any indication of a potential romantic relationship with either Rose or Jaroszewski, most people will assume Laserstein is heterosexual. Yet, as mentioned, this assumption is no more provable than her possible queerness. If we consider strong evidence in her biography, the only documented connection beyond friendship concerns her former fiancé, with whom she broke off the engagement. Since he isn't mentioned in many texts, I assume that he didn't play that big of a role in her life. Anyway, he counts as a close contact to her. So, there are several individuals of different genders who appear as in close contact. Her former fiancé, a close male friend in Sweden, and two female models, one in Berlin and one in Sweden. And it is mentioned that she might have wanted to have a love relationship with her master Erich Wolfsfeld, what didn't happen. Summing that up, there is one strong evidence and several speculations regarding love relationships with different genders. Given this context, wouldn't it also be logical to consider that she might have been bisexual? Interestingly, the term bisexual only appears in one text regarding Laserstein, and this mention is not tied to her museum representation. Lesbians are already largely invisible in the history of art. As this shows, bisexuality gets lost between assumptions of either heterosexuality or homosexuality and is not even considered at all.
So what does it mean to view art with a queer gaze? And why is it necessary to apply queer theory, somatic knowledge, and our own feelings to Laserstein's art in order to understand its symbolism and dig deeper into what wisdom and temporal observations are woven into the paintings? As queer people, we can understand and converse with art, adding in these often neglected perspectives that can enrich the experience of analysis and provide windows into understanding composition, movement, and meaning. Contextualizing Laserstein's life and work and recognizing her art as a part of the queer art canon provides possibilities for vibrant discoveries and imaginings. I spoke with Hannah Michelle Provisor about the knowledge and understanding they bring into their art analysis.
My name is Hannah Michelle Provisor. I use she, they pronouns. I am an artist and queer person. So it's like, yeah, I kind of say it as a joke. However, why not assume that every painting is queer? Because we spent a long time assuming every painting was straight. I'm just evening the scales a little bit. I'm balancing the scales. I think it's something that's easy for me to joke about, and like I think it's funny, and I'm like, haha, I'm gonna homosexualize all the paintings. But this really does pull in the weight to it, that it's so sad that we don't have a lot of this history accessible to us, because then we don't know. I mean, and I've been trying to do all of this research when there's so much that I can't find because it was not labeled correctly. It was thrown into the straight canon. So you have to dig and you have to assume. You have to build off of the stories that are there to think maybe there was something queer going on there. But yeah, it denies us our history. It's definitely gotten me a lot more interested in truly what's really going on in a painting, because I'm definitely, like, I love art. I've always loved art, but I've always kind of felt like when I go to a museum and I'm looking at a painting, I always wish I could be the kind of person that could stare at it for, 30 minutes. Like, I think that's so, I'm like, you must be way smarter than me. I think it's so amazing, and I have some art historian friends who like have explained to me what it is that they're actually looking for and like why they can spend that long looking at it. But for me, it makes me want to look more closely because I am imagining the potential for the relationship in that painting. And it makes me want to like dissect every detail and be like, look at where her hand is, and like look at where her eye is looking, and so it makes it more fun for me.
Hannah gives their analysis of one of Laserstein's paintings.
Well, I mean, also you sent me that one of her model behind her when she's like painting 29, with Lotte and her model Treptow. And she looks like sort of more masculine, which is obviously very clear. Oh yeah, it's so gorgeous with her little hand on her neck while she's painting. Oh my gosh. Yeah, see, but I wonder, I'm like, I wonder if we didn't know her story, if we didn't know who Lotte was, would a viewer, let's say, would a heterosexual viewer or would a heterosexual historian, like how many mind hoops would they have to jump through in order to see this as straight? Because I think you could. I think if you wanted to see it as straight, you could. It's just like, it's women friends, and that's clearly what we've done throughout all of history. So to me, I look at it and I'm like, oh my gosh, look at the tenderness and the way that her hand is placed there, and she's in such close proximity to her, and she's looking at the art. Lotte's looking out at the viewer, and the model has her hand on her. I see a tender queer relationship. But I wonder if someone who didn't know who Lotte was would read that into it, because I think for so long we spent a long time specifically not reading that into it, even if it's very much there.
Laserstein graduated with honors in 1927 and got her first studio on Friedrichsruherstrasse in Wilmersdorf. She ran her own private painting school and was involved in many artistic circles and exhibitions. Laserstein amazingly participated in over 20 exhibitions in the 3 years from 1928 to 1931. In 1931, Laserstein had her first solo show at the Gallerie. She was a member of the Verein der Berliner Künstlerin from 1929 to 1933, and she was on the board of the organization for a few years. She moved into her own apartment at Nadachstrasse 15 in Wilmersdorf in 1930. In 1928, she painted the striking Russian Girl with a Compact filled with deep reds and blues and whites for the Most Beautiful German Portrait of a Woman contest. She was in the final round of paintings that was exhibited as a tour in big cities in Germany. It is significant that she chose to paint an immigrant woman as the most beautiful German woman. She painted in the technique of alla prima, or wet on wet, with a palette characterized by deep reds and oranges contrasted by greens and blues. The reclining nude is a repeating motif in Laserstein's work, with elements that stand out to me and others as erotic, filled with queer desire and longing. Maybe most stunningly in the 1928 work In Meinem Atelier, in my studio. This 46 by 73 centimeter painting was made by layering oil paint on a panel of wood. The mood of the painting is soft, almost cozy, reminiscent of those days in Berlin when the snow has reached a nice layer on the roofs and it's almost completely silent when you open a window, like the sound is all absorbed by the fluffy flakes, and all you want to do is curl up on the sofa with a cup of tea, or in the case of Laserstein and Rose, create a painting that will inspire conversations for generations to come. I talked with Clara about what she thinks of this work.
Yeah, so one of my favorites, or maybe it's my favorite painting of Lotte Laserstein, is in my studio from 1928. That is often compared to the Sleeping Venus, like Traute Rose, her Berlin model is in front on a bed, and it's painted from front. And in the back, Lotte Laserstein herself is sitting in the back painting her, and then in the background of that you can see Berlin. So it's a painting that she made in her atelier or in her studio. I find it really impressive. I like the sensuality. I like how this painting blocks the male gaze. I like the way she used the stroke. It's so fine, and it's a really full painting. It's really, really detailed. Must have taken forever. And I like the style that she painted, how she painted, and I like the relationship between the painter and the nude model, and the shown respectful relationship that they have here. The pose is also really nice.
Like with the legs like that in the hand?
With the legs and how she painted the hand. That's impressive. And here you can see, like, she's part of the... Treptow is part of the painting. She's not being painted only, but she is... Yeah, she's part of it. This is also why Lotte Laserstein called their paintings our paintings. It's not my painting of you and me, but it's we did that together. You're part of the art. Yeah, there's one article that says it compares also the depiction of the palette that looks a little bit like a phallus. That it's also, if you interpret it in that way, that's a really interesting detail on the painting.
Yeah, it makes it even more erotic. Yeah, mm-hmm. And it's coming from her lap as well. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's great. It's great. You could read it so many ways, which makes it timeless. Which makes it a
totally
interesting piece for us. Mm-hmm. Whatever, 96 years later, to look at this.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, this is also why I like her painting so much, because a lot of them are timeless. You can, in some of the depictions of Treptow, you can't say that this is a woman from the 20s or the 30s. It could be someone living in Berlin right now. So right. This is, this is also why she's so interesting at the moment.
So special. As I researched this time period, I kept getting drawn into the phrase new Frau or new woman. To me, a non-binary, gender non-conforming person who spent many key adolescent and teen years as a closeted trans, but out as a gay femmish person, I found this archetype, style period, and classification of femininity very intriguing. All of these things that made a new woman, some take for granted today. Being politically active, driving, working out of the home, not being married, getting divorced, etc. Eliza Coyle takes some time explaining this cultural archetype. You can see many aspects of this archetype in Laserstein's portrait of journalist Polly Teak wearing a monocle and smoking in a club, or her self-portrait with a cat, where Laserstein wears a white artist smock, has a short pixie cut, and stares, without resolve, directly at the viewer. You should know, the cat that she was holding was given milk with brandy, so it would sit still. Clara adds in her perspective of Laserstein as a new woman.
So the new woman, it's the visualization of the new woman is really connected to the art of Lotte Laserstein. She painted. It's often said that she painted in a lot of paintings the new woman, and that she herself was or can be seen as a new woman. The new woman is a phenomenon of the 1920s or of the Weimar Republic. There were new opportunities for women. There were overcoming traditional gender roles in relation of tasks, of behavior, of look. And in the 19th century, it was a more political term, and in the 1920s, 30s, it changed a little bit more to a fashionable phenomenon, and also was criticized for that it lost its political power, and it was shown in films, in literature, in art, in magazines, in media. And it's about women who live a more self-determined life. It's about emancipation. It's about independency, especially independency from men. And it's more possibilities in their own life choices and all-day life choices, like when it comes to what you want to work, and also where you want to go, and even to go alone to a bar, for example. It's also independency for concerning sexuality and identity that was quite huge, especially in big cities where Laserstein lived. Also, as in a male-dominated area, a male-dominated profession, as a woman makes her a new woman in the end. This is the other thing, like how she represents herself, and especially Traute Rose and other women, they're totally new women, like a short haircut, and she even cut her hair, because Traute Rose had beforehand, she had long hair, and then they cut the hair that she could have typical like haircut. She cut it, yeah.
Okay.
I
guess
guess
just for the painting itself, but like she didn't.
No,
okay.
Yeah. she cut it.
Wow.
So there's one painting in Gasthaus, I think it's the name, where a person is sitting in a public restaurant alone. Like a woman is sitting in a restaurant alone, and that was quite rare at this time, or before that time that was rare, and now was possible. And so a lot of Laserstein takes this new gender roles and new possibilities. She's framing that in her art.
Hannah Steinkopf-Frank gives her observation and analysis of this painting from a fashion history perspective.
My name is Hannah Steinkopf-Frank. I use she, her pronouns. And I work as a journalist at Le Monde, the French newspaper, but I also do freelance work, reporting largely on issues around culture, history, a bit into politics, with a lot of focus around identity, whether that's around sexuality, a lot around Jewish identity. Yeah, I mean, I think they showed the connection with the clothes, how clothes can reveal about a person. Obviously, the gloves, right? There's this feminine idea of daintiness and, protection that comes with gloves, protecting these hands, these feminine features. But you're so right in that the leather gives this sense of masculinity and utilitarianism, with it. And it sort of lacks this daintiness. The fact that she's not looking while taking them off, it seems like almost sort of like a second thought in a way. That's just, taking them off. There's not this, sense of performance with it. It's just a very practical act, with the mind and the attention clearly being elsewhere. And, the fact that it's at the table, clearly looks like a perspective of, from the person across the table. And, you could imagine a more typical feminine heteronormative depiction that would have a very beautiful, taking off the gloves would be a representation of sensuality or femininity, and there it's a afterthought in a way.
Annelisa Leinbach was inspired by this painting, and she decided to use it as a composition inspiration for a self-portrait. She gives her thoughts regarding Laserstein's work and the painting Im Gasthaus.
I'm Annelisa Leinbach, she, her, and I'm an artist. I really love Laserstein's. I feel like there's this kind of sense of eroticism and power in the way that she portrays her characters that I just really love. And it feels very kind of like tender and powerful at the same time in a way that's really captivating. This painting is a really good example of this. I was really drawn to it because, I don't know, it just contains like several characteristics that I like. I mean, it's like this character who sort of has like a bit of a similar haircut to me and stuff. And I don't know, like I like that she's like wearing these gloves and either taking them off or putting them on. I've always really liked gloves. I feel like they have this kind of like feeling of elegance and power to them that I really like. And I really like this kind of, I don't know, it's like you don't exactly fully understand what's going on. Like, is this character feeling sad? Is this character feeling like powerful? I don't know. It's like there isn't so much being communicated in this character's expression, but I kind of view it as like this sort of feeling that I get when I'm like wandering around in a new place and I'm just kind of like looking at people and trying to understand the world around me, and there's this feeling of sort of like power yet also uncertainty and like the intimacy of connecting with these like strangers around you. And I found that really inspiring and cool. And I also think the way that her hand is positioned on the glove has this like sense of action to it that I thought was really cool. And I really love expressive hands in a painting, so I was very inspired by a bunch of those different things, and I was like, oh, I could totally imagine myself like making a painting that's not exactly the same as this, but has some similar elements.
This inspirational work was later bought in 1928 by the Berlin City Council. In addition to painting herself, models, and friends, Laserstein painted her family. She created beautiful work of her grandmother in the 1920s and also created the painting Am Motorrad in 1929 of her 10-year younger step-cousin from Berlin, Kurt Bernhard Lazarus. He was raised by her uncle Oskar Laserstein and her aunt Betty Hyman Laserstein, who was previously married to a man named Julius Lazarus, Kurt's father. The painting Kurt modeled for is incredibly detailed and draws you in as one notices the various textures and shades of brown. The model gives the same stare that Laserstein gives us in many of her self-portraits, and I cannot help but feel intrigued. The title translates to By the Motorbike, but it was the subject to frequent changes throughout the years.
She painted this Am Motorrad, at the motorcycle, this person where it's not really sure if it's a man or a woman, or this is the discussion that it's not that queer, although there is a saying that there is it's a cousin that it's shown, but still you can there's an interpretation of a could be an interpretation of a woman on the motorcycle, like being part of the new woman and possibility of movement. Already in the 30s, there was this. It was called Am Motorrad, at the motorcycle, but there's an article that said already there was using already der Motorradfahrer, so the motorcyclist, but in a gendered way, in a male gendered way. But when it was sold in London, it was also exposed as boy at a motorcycle. They didn't use at the motorcycle as a name. And so this way it also came from London to, under this name, it also came from London to Berlin to the Deutsches Historisches Museum. And so they just took the name that it was given. So they called it Junge am Motorrad, and then they changed it into Der Motorradfahrer, and now, after a hint of Anna Carola Krause, it's back to Am Motorrad, what is the original title.
The intertwining and history of motorcycles and queer femme and butch identities is a very powerful thing. Whenever I went to the Pride Parade in San Francisco growing up, the dykes on bikes were my favorite part. All the different bikes, all the different dykes, and as a young dyke, I was deeply impacted by the coolness and confidence they gave off, and tried to emulate that energy when I traveled to school on my bike, plastered with hippie stickers and rainbow stars in the spokes. When I first saw this painting, my breath was taken away. You can view it and all these other paintings I mention by clicking the link in the show notes. In 1930, she made the work Abend über Potsdam. It's 1 meter high and 2 meters wide and had to be transported by S-Bahn. In the 1930s, she also painted many front-facing detailed portraits and sketched herself nude. I love these sketches as she looks at the viewer and over her shoulder. You can see her paper and pen and curious glance not only at the viewer, but also herself. I spoke with Professor Kerry Wallach about the importance of researching and analyzing art from this period by Jewish women artists.
My name is Kerry Wallach. I use pronouns she, her. I work at Gettysburg College. I am a professor of German studies there and an affiliate faculty member with the Jewish Studies program as well. And I recently completed a book on the artist Rahel Szalit. It's called Traces of a Jewish Artist, The Lost Life and Work of Rahel Szalit. And it recovers a forgotten and murdered artist and hopefully brings her legacy into the present day for those who are interested in knowing more. There are a lot of different ways that we can think about why art made by Jewish women from the 1920s and early 1930s matters and what we can learn from it and how it helps us today. I think that art from this period, for one thing, and this also speaks to why I'm interested in this period more broadly, it shows us what kind of cultural flourishing is possible during a time when democratic freedoms abound. It shows us what Jewish art could look like in Germany when Jews were equal citizens and had access to ostensibly the same resources in general that their non-Jewish counterparts did. So this is what Jewish art looked like in a time of flourishing. These works by Jewish artists really also remind us that Jews contributed to German culture in many ways and were a vital part of this culture until 1933. And this is where we can get kind of ominous if we want to and think about this as a warning to us today. Jews who are fully integrated into a culture somewhere in the world can be fully integrated, doing wonderful, excellent work. But if circumstances suddenly and drastically change, it could all come crashing down. And I think that's the warning that I take from this period and that I take from the year 1933, and that many historians are also sort of constantly reminding us of. But that warning, that fear really is there, right? But to move away from that, I think it's also important to think about how works by Jewish women offer new perspectives on how women were viewed and perceived and experienced the world. If we compare two works with very similar subjects, one by a male artist and one by a female artist, we may be able to find differences that really could impact the viewer's understanding of what life was like at this time. So, for example, in my research, I compare works by Rahel Szalit with works by someone like Marc Chagall or someone like Jakob Steinhardt is a German Jewish artist we can compare her with. And really sometimes they're depicting very, very similar subjects, a woman on a street in what looks like perhaps an East European setting. But Steinhardt's woman won't necessarily be the primary focus of the image, or it won't be the most interesting part, whereas Szalit's will be looking out at the viewer and inviting sort of identification and really foregrounding the experiences for the viewer of what that woman was going through and what that woman's life was like. And of course, that could also be, that's also one of the things that I do in my research is think about how someone like Rahel Szalit, who was illustrating mainstream literature, might have also foregrounded the experience of female characters in those stories and really put them front and center in the images, almost telling a different story through the illustrations, right? Almost offering us a totally different perspective. And it's just not something that we always see with artists who did not identify as women. And it really helps sort of flesh out our perspectives of who was there in history, what were they doing, what were they undergoing, what were they experiencing. And I think without those perspectives of women artists, we're at a loss. We don't have the complete picture. We don't have access to the full set of experiences.
As written about in Professor Wallach's book on Rahel Szalit, Laserstein crossed paths with Szalit in their art careers, and they painted similar subjects. They were also on a judging panel for the VDBK Spring 1930 exhibit. In the early 1930s, Laserstein would go on study trips with her students to Teufelsmoor, Gellighausen, and Salenberg, where there are many wonderful photos from this time of her swimming, holding canvases, and looking at paintings with her students in rural, summery settings. But in 1934, after the Night of Long Knives and growing anti-Semitism and police questioning, it became even more dangerous to travel, and she stopped the trips. In the middle of the 1930s, Laserstein had to leave the Danjocross apartment. Her landlord was a known anti-Semite. She moved into an apartment at Genierstrasse 3 near Bayerscheplatz with no separate studio to make art. Because of growing anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic laws, opportunities were fewer and fewer for Jewish artists, who, by 1935, were no longer allowed to make money from exhibitions and commissions or teaching. Laserstein was also affected by these laws, and she had to shut down her own private painting school. Her collection of Toulouse-Lautrec posters was also stolen by Nazi police. Laserstein had been baptized as a Protestant, but had 3 Jewish grandparents. It's important to recognize and honor the paths of many Jews who were baptized and assimilated by naming those parts of their stories, but we can't erase their Jewish identity and life and experiences as racialized individuals persecuted for their Jewish ancestors and ethnicity. Because she was subject to anti-Semitic discrimination and boycotts, Laserstein became a part of the Jewish cultural apparatus to gain opportunities. She worked at the Jewish private school of Louise Zickel, where she was colleagues with her sister, Kata Laserstein, and her sister's partner, Rose Ohlendorf. In photos, the couple both have really cute round glasses. I talked with Professor Kerry Wallach about the support networks available for Jewish artists.
One organization I want to mention, because I think it's really worth further consideration and further study. Selka Strawn has written a little bit about this, but the B'nai B'rith Lodge in Berlin organized a lot of exhibitions to help Jewish artists in need, and Szalit participated in some of their exhibitions, for example, in 1920 and 1921, towards the beginning of the 20s, when she hadn't quite made her way into the Jewish scene yet, and those were very difficult years following the First World War. And they knew that there were sort of Jewish artists in need of support, and B'nai B'rith was there for them at that time.
There was also the Künstlerhilfe der Judische Gemeinde zu Berlin, or the Artists' Help of the Jewish Community of Berlin.
An organization called the Künstlerhilfe, and that was also organized by the Berlin Jewish community, reaching out to support Jewish artists in very concrete ways. Things like providing meals for them when they couldn't afford warm food, but also supporting them in artistic ways. So putting on exhibitions, and also other initiatives like postcards with their work featured on them, calendars featuring work of Jewish artists, contests. All of that was sort of designed to promote the Jewish artists who were being kind of overlooked by other aspects of German society. And that's all sort of driven by and within the Jewish community to support its own members, in addition to organizations like the Kulturbund that we can talk about later. So this is where we start to ask questions about who was Jewish and when and whether self-identification with Jewishness played a role in Jewish identity, and which artists self-identified as Jewish even before 1933, and which artists were identified as Jewish by others. And this is where it gets a little bit complicated. And I think Laserstein is interesting because I would put her in kind of a gray zone. She was baptized as a Christian and later then categorized by the Nazis as a Dreiviertel-Juden, right? Somebody with 3 Jewish grandparents, and who was therefore considered racially Jewish. So was she Jewish? Did she consider herself Jewish before 1933? I can't answer that question, but we can say that she was certainly Jewish enough to be persecuted. That's where we can land. And after 1933, it definitely becomes more interesting in thinking about her. But what I think is interesting, where I can add a little bit of my own research, before 1933, in the late 20s, when Laserstein was becoming a big name in Berlin, she was occasionally mentioned in the Jewish press. So the Jewish community was sort of claiming her, maybe because she had Jewish background, maybe not everyone knew that she didn't necessarily identify as Jewish, but for example, here's a case where the Jewish press mentioned Laserstein's portrait of Politik that was included in that 1929 exhibition, The Woman of Today, Die Frau von Heute. They mentioned that portrait of Politik, and then they said this portrait is of particular interest because it depicts a Jewish person, a Jewish writer, which is, again, kind of like really grasping at straws, right? Trying to sort of make something Jewish where it is not necessarily. And maybe that's sort of the press's attitude in general before 1933. But after 1933, things get more complicated with Laserstein. And even though she continued to be mentioned in articles about Jewish artists, so basically some Jewish critics had no trouble categorizing Laserstein as Jewish, as she was also categorized as Jewish from external forces. But not everyone considered her Jewish. And this is where it gets a little messy. And this is a very interesting story to tell. So Hannah Schutz and Hermann Simon, who were affiliated with the Neue Synagoge in Berlin, the Centrum Judaicum. So in their research on the art collection held by the Berlin Jewish community before World War II, Schutz and Simon have explored some of the ways that the Künstlerhilfe der Jüdischen Gemeinde zu Berlin came to the aid of many of the visual artists who were shut out of the Reichskulturkammer due to their Jewish background, right? There are about 1,600 artists that they mention who were shut out of the Kulturkammer, and that includes Laserstein. Some artists didn't officially belong to the Jewish community and were only identified as Jewish by Nazi ordinances. And because of that, because they didn't officially belong to the Jewish community, they were then not always permitted to participate in exhibitions of the Künstlerhilfe. The controversy was, it was controversial in the Jewish community whether baptized Jews, quote unquote, should be considered Jews. And some Jewish artists felt that they should not be, that they had sort of turned their back on their own Jewish identity and that the Jewish community was not necessarily going to open their arms to them at that time. So there was one exhibition in May 1935 where works by Lotte, Laserstein, and an artist named Fanny Remak were actually rejected after having been sort of accepted by the Künstlerhilfe, who had planned to include their images in their exhibition, but then later rejected. And they did this on the basis of sort of not wanting to stoke the fire, right? Not wanting to cause greater controversy. And the reason that they gave was that they needed to limit the number of exhibitors to limit the exhibitors to members of the Berlin Jewish community. Basically saying, we're putting this exhibition on to help the Berlin Jewish community, and if you're not a part of that, we can't help you. But one piece of correspondence that Schutz and Simon cite elaborates that around late 1934, and again, I have not seen this correspondence myself, so I'm citing the work of other scholars. Lotte Laserstein actually, in 1934, decided to leave Christianity behind and turn to Rabbi Dr. Joachim Prinz to arrange for some kind of return to Judaism. So I have no idea if that's true. I don't know if that would have been kind of an opportunistic move, like if I make my return to Judaism, then the Künstlerhilfe will let me exhibit in their exhibitions. But I think what it shows us is that there was a very, very fascinating moment for Laserstein in the mid-1930s where she was excluded from mainstream German structures, couldn't exhibit or participate in work in the broader German Nazi art scene at that time. So she actively sought a home in the Jewish community and in the German Jewish art scene of the mid-1930s, but she didn't quite manage to find her place there. Some accepted her, some did not, and I don't know if she was successful in whether making a kind of formal conversion or other kind of return to the Jewish community. I do know that she was successful in having at least one sort of private exhibition in December 1935 in the home of someone named Gertrude Weil in Berlin, and that her work was praised in the Jewish press at that time. So she was sort of finding other structures that were sort of Jewish community adjacent through which to show her art and be supported in her art, but not necessarily through the formal Künstlerhilfe, through the formal artists' structures. And it is really interesting to think about what she must have been going through at that time and what her connections to Jewishness must have been, really sort of an imposed Jewish identity, but then one she was also trying to embrace, perhaps partly because it was being imposed. But I don't know much about her sort of, I can't speak to whether or how many of the portrait subjects she painted were Jews and sort of all of those connections. But I do know that around 1937, when she emigrated to Sweden, she titled at least one painting something like Two Jewish Girls. So it was something, of course, she was thinking about. And she was painting other portraits of those who were Jewish emigres or who were connected to the Jewish community in Sweden. So I don't know about any explicitly Jewish themes from before 1933. I think we're less likely to find those. Of course, portrait subjects, but that's a different thing. But it's really interesting to think about where Laserstein fits, right, as somebody who didn't necessarily identify as Jewish before 33, but then really had to think seriously about how she wanted to be or how she wanted to fit with respect to the Jewish community if that was the only place she could fit in Germany in the 1930s before she emigrated. As I mentioned, Jewish artists were already supporting each other through various organizations even before 1933. The B'nai B'rith lodges provided support during the economically turbulent times of the early 1920s, for example. But there was obviously a much greater need for this kind of internal support after 1933, and the Jewish community also sort of broadened, right? It suddenly came to include artists who hadn't thought of themselves as especially Jewish before Hitler's rise to power, but who were identified as Jewish by the Nazis and were thus forced to sort of respond after 1933. So we know that from 1933 to 1938, Jewish artists were able to continue to make and exhibit art in Germany largely within Jewish contexts. The Jewish press continued to feature articles about Jewish artists, and this is one way we can read about what they were up to at this time. And we know that exhibitions were happening in different contexts. As I mentioned, the Künstlerhilfe of the Berlin Jewish community was also involved in supporting Jewish artists in the mid-1930s and promoting the work of Jewish artists. But the initiative that most people are familiar with is called the Kulturbund, and that's one of the largest initiatives that provided a space for Jewish culture to continue to exist and even flourish in some ways, in very limited, restricted ways. We often associate the Kulturbund with theatrical and musical performances, but it's important to also remember that they hosted exhibitions and lectures and were involved in promoting Jewish culture more broadly. And some of the art exhibitions were actually held at the Kulturbund's Berlin Theater. For example, in 1933, Julie Wolfthorn was one of several women artists who exhibited there. And one thing that I thought about in doing some thinking and reading about the artist Charlotte Salomon, who was only a student in Germany in the 1930s and whose work at least whose existing work was largely created later. Charlotte Salomon is someone who might have attended performances at the Kulturbund. Her stepmother, Paula Lindbergh Salomon, was a singer who performed there. So Salomon perhaps might have seen and been inspired by the art exhibitions that were held there, right? Sort of might have had access to Jewish art as an inspiration in addition to sort of more mainstream works of art. And also art by Jewish artists who were working within the constraints of the 1930s. Of course, the Kulturbund is really controversial in hindsight because those who stayed in Germany throughout the 1930s found it much harder to escape Germany. And after 1938, escape became much more urgent and necessary. So some claimed that the Kulturbund helped create the illusion that Jews were safe in Germany, which of course they were not. So that makes it a very controversial topic and one that we have to think about the sort of ethics of creating safe spaces in places that were not safe and what it meant to do that. But really all of those people involved in the Kulturbund were just trying to find a way to survive in the place that they had always called home and known to be home. And they had all lived in a democratically oriented society until just a few years prior, one that gave them sort of full and equal rights and privileges. So it's not that hard to understand why they would have thought of Germany as their home and not wanted to leave.
I spoke with Gail Prensky about her work researching the Judische Kulturbund.
My name is Gail Prensky. I am she, her. And I am the creator, the executive producer, and director of the Judische Kulturbund project, and we're based in Washington, D.C.
In this discussion, the term Kristallnacht is mentioned. It should be noted that many prefer the less euphemistic term Novemberpogroms to highlight that it was not just at night. A lot of this atrocity occurred during the daylight. And the result was not just broken glass or crystal, but it was a pogrom, an anti-Semitic act of violence and expulsion where hundreds of people were murdered and tens of thousands arrested, and thousands of synagogues and Jewish homes and businesses were destroyed.
I started the Judische Kulturbund project after reading about them, and I was in awe of their vision to not stand down, but to stand up to the Nazis when they came into power in 1933. They were Jewish artists, and they were fired from their jobs in high cultural places like the Stadt and the Berlin Opera and other places. So what they did was use their art to stand up to the Nazis. They formed in 1933, and they proposed to the Nazis that they be able to have their own cultural association to perform operas, dramas, symphonies, and cabarets for Jewish audiences only. And they existed until 1941. They started spreading after their original theater was formed in Berlin across the country. And most of those theaters closed in 1938 after Kristallnacht. But the original stayed open until September 11th. I think they got the notice from the Nazis to close. And that was then the beginning of the final solution. So what I first did was to find some funding so I could begin the task of interviewing as many of the Kulturbund artists as possible. So I filmed 15 associated to the Kulturbund. One of them was an actor in their first production in 1933 on October 1st. He was Nathan the Wise. And several musicians, a dressmaker, a student who was attending one of the performances of the Kulturbund in Berlin. Anyway, after filming these interviews, I started to think about how their stories and issues could connect to current-day artists around the world and explore how artists use their work in response to oppression. And I have filmed interviews and written stories of over 50 artists from 27 countries around the world. And just to emphasize, many of them are not Jewish. And the first two artists that I interviewed were Muslim. And I was really nervous. And it went so incredibly well because, again, this had nothing to do with religion. This has everything to do with the power of art and music. My focus has been and continues to be on the Kulturbund's performing arts, which is music and dance and acting. But I do know that the Kulturbund also had programs for lectures and artists and exhibits. That said, when I connect the issues of the Kulturbund to current-day artists around the world, we do include visual arts as well as performance. So I started, I think, in 2002 and went to Israel, where so one of the major founders of the Kulturbund was Kurt Singer, and his daughter she has since died, but she was living in Haifa, and her daughter, Kurt's granddaughter, lives in Tel Aviv. So, and then there was Uri Teplitz, a flutist. He also lived in Tel Aviv, and we were able to film an interview with him. He left the Kulturbund in 1936 to go to Palestine to be one of the founding members in the orchestra of the Palestine Symphony, so that was really fun. Went to Germany, where we interviewed the actor Ernst Leonard, and then I think there were 3 other interviews in Berlin that we did. A child musician that was in the Kulturbund, the artistic director's daughter.
So many people.
Yes,
it's incredible.
And then in New York, we were able to find 9 people, and we spent a couple of days filming them. They were mostly musicians, the dressmaker, and then the woman who was a student who went to see a performance. And we went to Florida. And interviewed Hannah. It's kind of interesting. You've heard of the frog in the boiling water, which, for those that don't know this little story, it's about when you put a frog in cold water and you turn up the heat a little at a time, the frog adjusts until it starts boiling, and either the frog needs to jump out of the pot or it dies, right? And I would say that the Nazis applied this same story to the Jewish people in Germany and eventually in Europe. The Jewish artists were fired in 1933, along with other people that were working in jobs and across Germany. And not only did they lose the ability to take care of themselves financially, but also in the orchestras and in the other theaters, it impacted those places as well. There were holes in their casts and in their crews, right? They were very talented people.
Yeah.
And so for them to create the Kulturbund, they also were able to make money through subscriptions and pay the artists. So some people would ask the question, by forming the Kulturbund, did it actually stall these Jewish artists from leaving sooner? Would they have been able to? Because they were being paid, right? But on the other hand, you could also question, would they have all been able to get visas and get out?
Right. Or even to pay for the visas or to pay for fake visas.
Exactly. I mean, we're running across this now for people today who are trying to get out. It's not easy to get a visa, right? So, meanwhile, while the Kulturbund was going on, the squeeze was continuing. So the first squeeze happened in October after the first production of Nathan the Wise. That story is about living peacefully in Jerusalem during the Third Crusade for Muslims, Jews, and Christians. Well, the Nazis didn't like that. They didn't like that symbolism, so they shut down the production on opening night. And then another example is in 1935. They told the Kulturbund, you can no longer play music or do plays composed by Austrian or German artists. And so they were Germans.
Right. Yeah, they were Germans, and
they weren't religious people.
Right.
But they actually started doing their homework and they started learning about Yiddish. Yiddish compositions of plays and music. They loved Sholem Aleichem, for instance. They could also play foreign music, but they could not play what they knew best, which were the masters, right? So that was a squeeze. They went, like like I said, some left and went to Palestine. And then in 1938, Kristallnacht happened, and they closed that. What they also started to do was be very selective about the pieces that they would perform that had hidden symbolisms.
Interesting.
Yeah, which is also what artists do today. They often have hidden meanings, and so that's also really interesting.
We spoke about how Laserstein was affected by the Nazis' rise to power.
What I think happened was in 1933, as we discussed with the other artists, she lost her privileges. She was not allowed to attend or teach at the school, be a part of the cultural landscape of Germany. And so she then, I believe, got involved with a cultural group. She was able to tutor, I think, and teach Jewish students. And then I think she started to, what's the name of the place? I don't know how you say it. Jenjar Strasse exhibitions, which was through the Judische Kulturbund.
For Laserstein, not having membership to the Reich Chamber of Culture as a Jew meant no longer being able to freely purchase art materials. This is not only an awful way to economically punish people, but also psychological torture for artists who need to create. I have been deeply considering the responsibility of my freedom as I, a queer Jew today, am receiving money from the Demokratie Leben program, which is funded by the Federal Ministry for Family Affairs, Senior Citizens, Women, and Youth, to buy and distribute art supplies for this workshop series without needing to present any kind of membership card. When less than 90 years ago, Laserstein and thousands of other Jewish artists could not do the same. Laserstein's art was subject to increasing scrutiny and discrimination. The 1927 Gasthaus was confiscated as degenerate art. It was later revealed that this piece was stolen by a Nazi art dealer and passed to a few other owners until it was sold for 110,000 euros in 2012. I spoke with Eliza about what the term degenerate art means and its origins. At the 1937 Munich exhibit, all of the art in the room was simply the most powerful of its time. The works were smashed up all against each other, less of the wide berths around paintings we have come to understand today, but rather stacked on top of each other in no seemingly curatorial style other than the back of a small-town thrift store, except this time with a catalog and remarks on the wall of fascist and anti-Semitic sentimentality. With the reappearance of Im Gasthaus in auction only 12 years ago and so many other looted paintings being quote-unquote discovered, I asked Dr. Eva Atlan about her experiences with Raubkunst, or stolen art.
My name is Eva Atlan, and I'm a deputy director of the Jewish Museum in Frankfurt. We had several restitutions of paintings from collections from Jewish collectors to getting back into the collection of the museums.
Interesting.
And the thing is also that there's a generation now, a new generation, and the older people who were collectors are now having their children and grandchildren looking at the collections. And so new information can come up. So that's also very important.
That's great.
We have a lot of people coming to the museum who say we have from our grandfather something, or grandmother, or we have empty the home from them, and we found something, and we didn't know what is it. So this is this generation, the new generation, and that's why a lot of paintings or art objects are coming out now.
It is a disgraceful state of affairs that still today, many pieces of stolen art and cultural objects are locked away in attics or safe deposit boxes instead of being returned to Jewish institutions and the Jewish families of artists and art collectors. Laserstein had the opportunity to escape Germany to Sweden in 1937 through her solo exhibition with almost 60 pieces, including Abend über Potsdam at the Gallerie Moderne in Stockholm. After this, thanks to the Jewish Aid Committee, she got many opportunities to paint portraits. At the time, she was also painting very beautiful flowers and landscapes. Lotte Laserstein married Sven Marcus in 1938 to get Swedish citizenship, a purely pro forma marriage, so that after, she no longer needed to continuously extend her residency permit every few months. They never lived together. During this time, she was also trying to help her mom and sister escape, but despite her best efforts, it was not possible. In 1939, Laserstein's mother visited Sweden, but returned to Berlin in September, the day that the UK declared war on Germany. She did not tell the Nazi police where her daughter Kata was hiding in Berlin. In 1943, Mette Laserstein was murdered 90 kilometers north of Berlin at Ravensbrück. Kata Laserstein and her partner, Rose Ohlendorf, were hiding with Lucy Friedlander in Ohlendorf's teachers Gertrude Koptisch's shack in Wilmersdorf. Lily Wurst took in the three women in February of 1945, 5 months after her girlfriend, Felice Strengenheim, was deported to Theresienstadt. It is important to note that Strengenheim's Jewish friends have later said they didn't trust Wurst, that their relationship was unhealthy, and they believed that she was the one who tipped off the SS, which got her deported and murdered. Laserstein, Ohlendorf, and Friedlander all survived the liberation in May, but Lucy Friedlander died by suicide in August, and she is buried at the Weissensee Jewish Cemetery. Kata Laserstein immigrated to Sweden in 1946, but it was only temporary, and went back to Berlin in 1954, working as a senior teacher in Dahlem. Lotte Laserstein said, reflecting on this time,
"Reality? That is and has been my work since I was a child. If I hadn't had my own reality in my paint box, this little suitcase, I wouldn't have been able to get through the years when everything was taken away from me. Family, friends, and home."
In Sweden, Laserstein became connected to the Jewish community. She painted many incredible portraits of the new German diaspora. She also made posters and designed book covers. The painting, The Emigre, created in 1941 of her friend Dr. Walter Lindenthal, is a haunting snapshot of Laserstein's reality at the time. Adjusting to life as a refugee, separated from her family and friends back home, she had to rapidly create new community and opportunities to survive. Later, Lindenthal and Laserstein would travel to Israel together. Margareta Jaroszewski, who met Laserstein in 1939 and became her model in Sweden for many beautiful nude portraits, mostly of Margareta or Madeleine's back.
I'm not there with my research on her, but I know that she is sometimes also interpreted as a relationship of Lotte Laserstein. Also, there's no evidence on that, but there's something that is similar, like how she worked together with Lotte Laserstein is similar how Treptow worked with her, but the paintings differ quite a lot. Like there's an intimacy, and there are also some paintings who are in reminiscence of other paintings that Laserstein had with Treptow. But you can see it's another feeling in between them in the painting. It's representing something else. Still, you can have a, let's say, queer gaze on that. That's for sure. And also, for example, there's one painting. It's a Rückenakt, the backside of a nude painting of Margarete Jaraszewski that is in the Schwules Museum, and so in some way you could say it's people frame it as a relationship as well. But on the other side, it's similar than in Treptow's and Lotte Laserstein's case that you don't have an evidence.
At the Berlinische Gallerie archive, I got to look at Laserstein's passport from 1950 to 1955, and it is a striking document. It is encased in a thin black leather, and the lettering is in gold. I can't believe she held this when she was re-entering Germany after the Shoah. In her photo, she looks frazzled and tired. She must have been around 51 or 52. Her hair is a bit frizzy and pushed back into a short bob. Her eyes are sunken in, and she has a gray or maybe blue blazer on. A visa for Berlin that was stamped on October 31st, 1951 reads that the bearer of this passport is permitted to enter Berlin by authority of the Allied Kommandatura. Laserstein traveled extensively. I counted 49 stamps in total for this 5-year period. Laserstein traveled to visit Erich Wolfsfeld in 1947 and 1955 in England. She traveled with Jaraszewski to France in 1951, and she reconnected with Treptow and Ernst, whom she had been writing with in 1946. She was denied membership into the KRO, or the Swedish Trade Union for Art, several times because her art was not modern enough. Laserstein was commissioned to paint the governor of Kalmar and his wife in 1952, and after getting to know the area, she bought a small home, and during the end of the 1950s, Laserstein made southern Sweden her home until her death. Later, it was also written about in Swedish papers that she was the first to have a pool in Åland. In 1961, 16 years after the end of World War II, Laserstein was finally recognized as a victim of Nazi persecution and received reparation payments. She took some art supplies with her as she made trips around the world. She went to Spain in the 1960s and to California. She went to San Francisco and Los Angeles, France, Italy, Switzerland, Greece. One of the folders in the archives that selected to be pulled for me had some incredible loose sketches. She drew little tiny paintings on the sides of her letters that she sent back to her friends during her travels. I noticed fields of horses, houses with red roofs, mountains, girls looking out of windows and boardwalks to the water, people shaving sheep, landscapes of lakes and reeds, relaxing in a hammock, boats, rocks. She was finally accepted to join the Swedish Association of Fine Arts in 1963. 2 years later, in 1965, her sister Käthe Laserstein died. Lotte Laserstein was recognized for her incredible work in 1977 with the Kalmar Culture Prize. For her 80th birthday in 1978, there was a retrospective of her work in Kalmar, and she was constantly exhibited in Sweden. When I visited the Berlinische Gallery, I was told I was the first person to want to dig into the Jewish connections to Laserstein's later life and work. I'm very glad that I made this request and visit. I found some very interesting documents sent by her community and friends for her 80th birthday that showed that Laserstein personally gave work and artistic energy to help the cause of the Stockholm Children and Youth Aliyah, as referenced in a certificate showing that 10 trees were planted in her name in Israel to honor her birthday. In their donation certificate, the Children and Youth Aliyah Organization of Stockholm sent wishes for her good health and said thank you for your support. I did some further research and found that Laserstein created a beautiful drawing of a boy playing the guitar with the providence that it was made or sold to raise money for the Swedish Youth Aliyah organization. This organization provided life-saving help to Jewish children during and after the Shoah by providing Hashira training in Sweden before they made Aliyah. They gave foster parents money to help the children and their well-being, gave vocational trainings, ran orphanages and boarding schools for children in need who had also come from Germany. In the archive, I found 4 cards totaling up to 27 trees that her friends donated for her 80th birthday through the Keren Kemet Israel, or Jewish National Fund. From these certificates, with small personal notes, we know that she was beloved and honored in a very meaningful way by her Jewish community. This is a classic Jewish diaspora gift for birthdays, naming ceremonies, b'nai mitzvahs, graduations, marriages, a go-to for special occasions. Under each donation certificate are lines of prose about nature and God. The bottom edges of the card are outlined in lime green, and there's a beautiful print of trees in the center. I wonder how she felt to get these donation certificates. Did she also donate trees in honor of her friends? Laserstein continued to have retrospectives of her work, and in 1983 she met art collector Peter Fors, who would become her close friend and keeper of her artistic estate until donating it to the Berlinische Gallerie in 2009. In 1987, when Laserstein was almost 90 years old, there was an exhibition being arranged on Laserstein's teacher, Erich Wolfsfeld, by curator Caroline Guy, previously Caroline Straude, at the Agnews and the Belgrave Gallery in London. And from the journey that Caroline Guy made to visit Laserstein and see her fantastic works, it was decided that Laserstein should have her own exhibition. This was successful and began the start of her works being seen more and desired more. When in London, Laserstein visited with Treptow Rose. Laserstein's self-portraits from her senior years are beautiful, often in similar compositions that she made decades earlier. She reflects on aging and her life and how her body has changed. On January 21st, 1993, Lotte Laserstein died in Kalmar, Sweden. She was known as the Grand Old Lady of Painting and continued to create works in her last years.
In 1993, Lotte died. She was 94. She lived a really nice long life after all of that. Another example of a woman's courage and determination, and she kept the culture alive.
Her friends also kept her memory alive. In Laserstein's estate archives, I found a document embellished with a red Magen David, which stated that after Laserstein's death, her friends donated money to buy first aid supplies in her memory to the Swedish Magen David Adom for Israel as a memorial gift. After experiencing exile, discrimination, and cutting off of social contacts in Germany, it was difficult for her to regain the acclaim she had before. It was only towards the end of her life and after she died that her work started to be celebrated in a larger way outside of Sweden. Dr. Anna Carola Krause's thesis in 2003 created a broader and wider recognition of Laserstein's life and work. The purchase of the 2-meter-long Abend über Potsdam was made by the New National Gallery in 2010. Her painting, Female Back Nude Madeleine, from 1956, was bought by the Schulz Museum. Her work has now been shown around the world at the Moderne Musik, Ephraim Palace, Stadtteil Museum, Berlinische Gallerie, Israeli Museum, Leicestershire Museum, New Museum for Women Artists in Washington, D.C., and many more galleries. But most of her works are in private collections. Laserstein's story has been featured in many creative and research projects. Visual artists and writers are inspired by her compositions and skillful techniques. Notably, Rebecca Ness's 2024 Self-Portrait with a Cat, after Laserstein, and Annelisa Leinbach, with whom you can hear more about her process in her long-form interview. In 2017, the play Evening over Potsdam, written by Sarah Nemes and Lutz Hubner about Laserstein, premiered in Potsdam, and in 2024 it was translated and performed in Swedish at the Moderna Musik. In 2021, Anne Stern published a historical fiction book called My Friend Lotte, and in 2022, the Swedish graphic novel Remind Us to Live by Joanna Ruben Drager writes about her Aunt Suzanne, who was painted by Laserstein. In Berlin, the research collective Vazwerk makes theater pieces and podcasts about Lotte and Kata Laserstein. I learned about some of Laserstein's cousins through Raymond Wolfert's book on the lawyer Botho Laserstein and his biography with the Frankfurt Citizens Foundation about Ruth, maiden name Laserstein Hoffman, who attended a Zionist training camp, a Hashirah, in Jessen and left for Haifa in 1937 when she was only 15 years old. After the Shoah, she moved to Frankfurt and was heavily involved in the Jewish community and charity work there until her old age, passing away in her late 90s. On a few cold and blistery days this fall, I took my microphone on an adventure to southwest Berlin. I was off to see the physical reminders and memorials of Laserstein's life outside of the museum settings. In 2020, a plaque was revealed at her last residence in Berlin before she left to Sweden, at Genierstrasse 3 in Wilmersdorf. Annelisa and I went to visit after our interview and set down a stone below to honor her memory. I later traveled to Lotte Lasersteinstrasse, located next to Südkreuz station in southwest Berlin, which was named after her in 2007. We have arrived at Lotte Lasersteinstrasse. I'm going to walk a little bit up the street. Walk to the gay flag. That's nice. There's a gay flag. This is pretty amazing. There's like hundreds of pigeons atop this one building, and the giant pigeon painted on the building. Whoa, they all just left. It is a loop with new buildings and a parking lot. The most interesting structure was the Traube House, a house where doves are given medicine, food, and cared for. It is an aluminum structure with a spray-painted giant pigeon. I want to believe Laserstein would have liked to know that on her street, that is named after her, is a house of very well taken care of birds. After this, I went to her mom's house, took 3 buses, and then an hour later past the planetarium to Stieglitz, I arrived at a block of beige houses with red accent marks. Eventually, I reached Immerweg 7, where Mette Laserstein lived. I looked around for the Stolperstein that was placed there in 2010, but I couldn't find anything. I tried to ask someone approaching, and he didn't know anything about it either, and he didn't even know what a Stolperstein was. I swallowed my shock, and I asked him, is there any knowledge of a memorial here for a Jewish woman? She lived here. He didn't know, and he walked away. I stood there, shocked for a few minutes, and then I pulled out my microphone, and I took a photo, and then I just went home. I started this project because I wanted to come face-to-face or ear-to-ear with the places, spaces, and emotions of these artists. I wanted to check up on the memorial efforts that existed to honor their memories and see how they made me feel and what I noticed. In the case of visiting Mette Laserstein's Stolperstein, I felt so angry. How could these neighbors not know what a Stolperstein was? How could they live on a street where Mette Laserstein lived and not know about her? What has happened that these memories of Jewish neighbors have been so erased? The Jewish population of Germany went from 525,000 in 1933 to 37,000 in 1950. Generations later, only a small fraction of Jews are remembered through memorials such as Gedenktafel or Stolperstein or other neighborhood efforts. And some of these memorials are gone or hidden or inaccessible and unknown to the neighborhood. There is so much work to be done to remember their lives and what happened. How will you make sure their memories live on? Will you clean a Stolperstein? Will you encourage your local library to buy books about Jewish history? Gail Prensky says it best of why it's so vital for us to remember this history.
I think it is important that people know about the artists during the Shoah because memory is important to know that it doesn't stop. For some reason, humanity's dark side keeps happening again and again, and the idea of never again is... It's in bold neon lights right now, as far as I'm concerned. And I think that these artists surviving and keeping their culture alive is extremely important. I think that there is power in art in being able to express yourself, to be able to connect with others, to encourage empathy, to encourage the universality of humanity, to nurture love, to find common language and to merge generation, multi-generation connection. I think that music and art in all of its forms is a surprise that I enjoy when I work with people in our workshops, that they discover that they are creative and that they have a mechanism to respond to difficult times, and they don't need to use violence, but they can use beauty.
I invite you to take some time to dive into one of Laserstein's paintings with me, Selbstportrait mit Strauchhut, Self-Portrait with Straw Hat, painted in 1953. Unfortunately, the work I chose is not available to view at any museum, archive, or private collection. It has been listed as whereabouts unknown. You can still find a photo of this beautiful painting in the book Lotte Laserstein, My Only Reality by Anna Carola Kraus on page 306. We meet Laserstein on her 45.1 by 53.3 centimeter canvas, painted landscape style, on a summery or spring day when wearing a hat is fashionable and suggested. Laserstein has on a marvelous hat, tilted in a way that asks the viewer to engage, to examine, and to admire. So we do. Her hat is made of straw, and it takes up the majority of the upper right quadrant of the painting. It is painted various shades of beige, yellow, and brown with loose squiggly brushstrokes to create the look of weaving in and out of different threads of straw. We notice the shadows and depth of the material. On closer inspection, one can notice greens, blues, and pinks in the hat. The brightest part of the painting is the brim, doing its job absorbing the sun's rays. The back of the hat flips up a little bit and appears dark. In the middle, the hat continues upwards, and we cannot tell if it ends at a point far above her head, like an upside-down ice cream cone, or has an end seam where the painting cuts off. It is an intriguing shape, sculptural in nature and dynamic how it flops on her head. It appears to pop off the canvas with its realistic and 3D nature and contrast in color to the rest of the painting. Just below her hat are her piercing eyes. Darkened by the shadows of the hat, but still striking, Laserstein looks at us without any reservation in her signature style, breaking the fourth wall down with a glance, inviting us to engage, to stare back, to pay attention to her and her surroundings. Her face is in a 3/4 view, only one ear and some of her dark brown curly hair visible trailing down her neck. She appears with a neutral but curious expression, lips closed, and her nose and chin are highlighted brighter than the rest of her face. From the bottom left of the canvas, her arm appears, with her hand positioned to hold her face, supporting her stare, her analysis of us, the viewers. The painting follows a clear diagonal line made by Laserstein's elbow in the bottom left and extending through her hand, eyes, and hat to the top right corner, where some of the darkest values of the entire painting appear. Her thumb rests close to her mouth, and her middle and index finger pressed against her upper cheek, a position of contemplation. Around her wrist is a black cord, maybe the strap of a watch. The arm of her blouse is white, with some pale pinks and blues reflecting off her sleeve. A most peculiar coloring appears on the shoulders. Instead of the same white as her arm and thigh, her shoulders and chest blend in with the background abstract pattern and blotches of pink, maroon, dark blue, light blue, and beige. It's almost like she is showing us how she becomes her work. It reflects off of her, she reflects onto it. Even her face has areas of blue and pink that are recognizable as similar to the pattern behind her and on her jacket. The areas of color are not uniform in nature or appear planned out, and that is what makes them even more delightful. A twist of a brush here, a dollop of paint there, maybe this shade looks good here as well. Her quickness and confidence is visible, and her knowledge of her own shapes and forms and proportions. The mood of this portrait is inquisitive, almost playful. She is placing herself in an anonymous and artistic abstract setting, and we are glimpsing her creative process and incredible fashion. I interpret this painting as Laserstein trying to come to terms with the various pieces, memories, friendships, and experiences of grief and loss after her forced exile in 1937. By the time she painted this, Laserstein had returned to visit Germany, and a year later, her roots in Sweden continued to grow deeper after she bought her summer home on the coast. I understand this work as an integration and reflection of sorts. All of these experiences over the past 20 years since 1933, all of the trauma she endured, all of the pieces of herself, and literal pieces of her art she had to leave behind and collect after the Shoah are displayed in abstract blobs behind her. If you stare at the background for long enough, the brain can recognize patterns like the outline of a person sitting down, a house on a mountain, clouds above a lake. This is a very rare painting of hers, where there is no defined or realistic background for the viewer to ground into, and so we are lost in its chaos, attempting to find our own meaning of an unclear reality, an experience that approximately 10,000 Roma and Jewish refugees who found Sweden their home after 1945 had to face. Reflecting on the reality around us today, we can think about how we can make the world a softer place, how we can build a society with love and kindness to help ease the transitions into a new environment. What can we do as individuals when we notice a new neighbor needs support? We can be giving, we can be kind, we can be curious, and we can show love and humanity and build this better world together. Thank you so much to everyone who helped with this project and to the guest experts who decided to take time out of their days to speak with me. You can find more information about everyone I spoke with and their work in the show notes. The full bibliography with sources and links can be found on the show website www.passingthepaintbrush.wordpress.com. The current artists we are exploring this season are Lotte Laserstein, Gertrude Zandman, and Tony Ebel, 3 incredible painters who survived the Shoah. This is a project hosted by Spinnboden Lesbian Archive and funded by Demokratie in der Mitte's Aktionsfund. Follow Friends of Dora on Instagram for further updates on upcoming episodes and workshops. I used the following music and sounds in this episode: Gazing by Andy G. Cohen from the Free Music Archive, released under a Creative Commons BY 4.0 International Attribution License. Easy Going Music Loop by Seth Makes Sounds from freesound.org number 691837, released under Creative Commons 0. Morning in Nebraska.aiff by Danjocross from freesound.org number 503209, released under Creative Commons 0. Sunshine on the Pool by Gilboa from the Free Music Archive, released under a Creative Commons BY 4.0 International Attribution License. This episode featured the following incredible music by Tzipora, played with permission from the artist: Olam Chesed Yevane from the album Ain't No Power, and Eshet Chayil, Woman of Valor, from the album Tales of the Diaspora. Buy Tzipora's amazing music on Bandcamp, links in the show notes. I have also used the following public domain classical music recordings made available by the Open Educational Resources on Music, created by Ulrich Kaiser. Bela Bartok's 83 Concerto for Piano and Orchestra, number 1, SC 83A2 Andante, played by the Radio-Symphony-Orchestra Berlin, conducted by Ferenc Ferice. Hannah Michelle Provisor read Laserstein's quotes. If you want to tell your friends about this podcast or rate it on whatever platform you are listening from, that would be a free way to really help share the project with those who would be interested but do not know of it yet. This episode was written, produced, and mixed by me, Hanny, with technical advising by Rocket Loam. Thanks for listening, and stay creative.